Hello everyone, Silent K here, and it's time to review some more cards. But before that, I wanted to do a quick update on a card from last video. I reviewed it rather poorly, and I've been thinking about it all week, and I think maybe I judged it a little too harshly. Surprisingly, nobody chewed me out for it. Usually people do. Not that I mind, but... Anyway, let's take a second look at Worm God of the Skies. Legendary, 9 mana 5/6, last words during your next turn double the attack and defense of each allied Dragoncraft follower that comes into play. So last time I gave this a -2, but really, thinking about it, with this score system, -2 should be reserved for cards that are like entirely unplayable or entirely outclassed by other cards. I judged it a bit harshly because it's a slow card for 9 mana and you're not guaranteed to get value out of it. Thinking about it a bit more though, even though it's not a fantastic card, and even though it's not always going to be 100% consistent, it's still not unplayable. Even if you just play Forte or Genesis Dragon by itself afterwards, that's still a decent chunk of damage, and a 16/8 Ouroboros is nothing to scoff at. So while I do think Dragoncraft is going to have better win conditions next expansion, it's still not a terrible card. So I'm going to upgrade the overall score to 0. Moving on to the new cards. First up for Bloodcraft, Furtive Fangs. 1 mana spell, choose an allied neutral follower. Whenever that follower attacks an enemy follower, destroy the enemy follower before it can deal any damage in return until the end of the turn. So here we have the wolf from Little Red Riding Hood, of course. I recently pre-ordered a wolf figure to go with one of my Red Riding Hood figures. I know that's not the most interesting story, but we already talked a little bit about Red Riding Hood, so not much else to say. As for the card, it's Medusa's Gaze for 1 less, but it only works on neutral followers. Medusa's Gaze does see some play, so it's pretty decent if you're playing a neutralcraft blood deck, but it's not game changing since the card is literally already in the game. So overall 0. Next up, Scarlet Sabre, 5 mana 2/4, Bane, Fanfare, deal 2 damage to an enemy, then restore 2 defense to your leader. This is Wardrobe Raider 2.0. She doesn't need an evolve point to get the effect, and she also has Bane, but she does cost 1 more. Between this and Big Knuckle Bodyguard, Control Bloodcraft's mid-game is looking pretty solid. Overall, +1. Next, Demon Key, 3 mana Amulet, countdown 5. Whenever your leader takes damage during your turn, subtract 1 from this amulet's countdown. Last words, at the start of your next turn, randomly put one of the highest cost followers from your hand into play. This is a typical lose tempo now to gain tempo later card, except for 2 major drawbacks. First of all, it uses 2 cards, unlike things like Havencraft Amulets or Frozen Mammoth, which spawn free tokens. This uses a card from your hand, so you're investing 2 cards just to get 1 follower into play. Second, this has very little synergy with high cost followers outside of Storm and Rush. Since the card is put into play at the start of your turn, it's still subject to summoning sickness. So the best cards this has synergy with are Soul Dominator, Iceblade Warfiend, and possibly even Archangel Reyna. When you're investing 2 cards and tempo, that's not really a great synergy. So overall, -1. Oh, and this card does have some synergy with the next card we're going to look at, so maybe that's enough to save it. Next up, Spawn of the Abyss, Legendary, 8 mana 6/7, Ambush. When this follower attacks, deal 6 damage to the enemy leader if Ambush is active for this follower. Last words, deal 6 damage to the enemy leader if Ambush is active for this follower. Evolve text is basically the same, except it does 8 damage. So with Enhanced to Lightning Blast out of the game, this follower is guaranteed to deal at least 6 face damage, barring damage soaking effects on the opponent's board. If it goes face, it deals 12 damage on the first swing, 16 if evolved, which is pretty insane for an ambush follower that hasn't been buffed at all. It's a pretty good card on its own, but it also has strong synergies with Baphomet, Bandersnatch, and the previously looked at Demon Key. This guy will definitely see some play. Overall +2. On to Dragoncraft, Fortress Crab, 9 mana 6/8, Ward. Evolved, it gains last words, put a Fortress Crab into your hand. The giant enemy crab has arrived, and it's just a 6/8 ward. The last words do make it a little bit better, but you still need to evolve it to get that, so still not fantastic. Overall -1. Next, Jabberwock, Legendary, 8 mana 7/7, Fanfare, destroy all other allied followers. For each follower destroyed, put a random follower that costs more than the destroyed follower from your deck into play. So in the last video I mentioned Lewis Carroll's poem Jabberwock a few times, and this is the star of that poem. He was slain by the Vorpalblade, which goes snicker snack, and that poem was of course featured in the second Alice book, Through the Looking Glass, as previously mentioned. So that's why the Jabberwock and the Vorpalblade are sometimes associated with Alice. As for the card, it's a very straightforward win more card. If you have a board, it basically heals and upgrades your followers, but if you don't have a board, then it doesn't do anything at all. For an 8 mana legendary, it's pretty weak. Overall, -1. Onto Forestcraft, Wood of the Brambles. 2 mana amulet, count down 2, fanfare, put 2 fairies into your hand, give all allied followers in play and all allied followers that come into play, clash, deal 1 damage to the enemy follower. This is not a bad fairy generator. It's basically just Fairy Whisper, except you get buffs instead of a 1/1 on the board. It's better than the other amulets Forestcraft has been receiving recently, but it's not really great either. Overall 0. Next, Sylvan Elder, 6 mana 4/5, Ward. Fanfare, give all other allied followers +1/+1 if you have at least 3 neutral cards in your hand. He's subpar. If you're willing to run a class 6-drop in your neutralcraft forest deck, even Elf Knight Cynthia or Crystalia Erin are both better utility. This guy could sort of fill in for those cards in a budget deck, but he still falls pretty short of them. Overall -1. Next, Flower Princess, 4 mana 2/4. Fanfare, put 2 fairies into your hand if you have 2 or less neutral cards in your hand. Put a Thornburst and 2 fairies into your hand if there are at least 3 neutral cards in your hand. This is a fairly decent fairy generator even in a normal Forestcraft deck. It's really good in a neutralcraft forest deck, barring the anti-synergy of running class-based neutralcraft cards. Depending on how many Forestcraft cards you want to run in your neutralcraft forest deck, this might not make the cut, but it's still pretty good. Overall +1. Next up, Beauty and the Beast, Legendary, 6 mana 5/6, Fanfare, gain +2/+2 if you have at least 5 cards in your hand, gain resistance to damage and destruction from spells and effects if you have at least 3 neutral cards in your hand. So Beauty and the Beast is of course a wonderful classic fairy tale about Stockholm Syndrome and bestiality. Want to find true love, children? It's easy. Just lock a girl in your castle until she has no choice but to love you. And they lived happily ever after. Actually, Beauty and the Beast is one I haven't read any versions of. I've only seen the animated Disney film back in the day. There's also a new live-action Disney film, but I haven't seen that yet. As for the card, it's subpar without any procs. It's mediocre if you get the first proc, and it's really good if you get both procs, so this is going to be judged as a neutralcraft card. Meeting the requirements for both procs is really easy for a neutralcraft forest deck. You have card draw and card generation from cards like Goblin Mage, Kai'Sa, and Goblin Princess. And you have fairy generation, which doesn't count towards your neutral cards, but it does buff your hand size. This is a pretty good card, but it doesn't offer a ward or any immediate effects, so overall +1. Next, Fairy Dragon, Legendary, 2 mana 3/2, can't be targeted by spells or hit. Hey, wait a minute. Nice try, Ben Brode. Sneaking that in there. Alright, that's better. Fairy Dragon, Legendary, 2 mana 0/4, Ward. Fanfare, add X to this follower's attack. This value equals the number of allied fairies that have been destroyed this match. This starts off pretty bad since your opponent can kill it for free, but becomes decent value after about 2 fairies have died. After that, it's a cheap chump blocker that you can drop in the mid-late game to protect something more important, sort of like Heavenly Hound. Forest already has low-cost ward that can be buffed though in the form of Ancient Elf. Ancient Elf also supplies a bounce utility, which is important for a lot of forest cards. This might not be bad in the mid-game for a Temple Forest if you play it as like a 4/4 or something for 2 mana. But Temple Forest is already a somewhat costly deck, so it's going to be hard justifying the vials for this card. Overall, I'll give it a 0 for general value, but it's going to be a very low crafting priority even if it ends up seeing play. Onto Havencraft. First up, Noishoe, Red Branch Knight, 2 mana 2/2, Fanfare. Until the start of your next turn, your leader cannot receive more than 3 damage at a time. So first up, we have to talk about pronunciation. I definitely had to look up the pronunciation of this name, and there was some conflicting information. After a lot of research, it seems like there are two main ways to pronounce this name. The first is the modern pronunciation, which is Nisha or Nesha, and then there's the traditional pronunciation, which this character being of Irish folklore would be using, and that's Noishu. So I'll be calling it Noishu, not 100% sure if that's correct, so don't take my word for it. Moving along, the story of Noishu, the Red Branch Warrior, and Deirdre is an Irish legend about a girl too hot for this world. When Deirdre was born, a prophet told the king of Ulster she would be so hot she would cause murder and war over her beauty, so he decided to raise her in secret and marry her himself when she became old enough. Why not? Fast forward to her teenage years, and she falls in love at first sight with a boy named Noishu. They run away together to avoid the king's wrath, but no matter where they go, people are willing to straight up kill for a chance to bang Deirdre. Eventually they receive word from the king that he's forgiven them and willing to let them come back to Ulster and live together safely. They return, and of course it ends up being a lie, and Noishu is assassinated and Deirdre is captured to be married to the king. She decides suicide is a better option, however. As for the card, it's an interesting effect since you're guaranteed to be able to use it, as long as you anticipate enough incoming damage from the opponent. If it blocks any damage, this is basically an alternative to Unica. On curve it doesn't really do anything, but neither does Unica. Obviously Elena Haven would still prefer to have Unica for the healing, and many Control Haven decks don't really care that much for board presence, and they only run Beast Call Aria because it's a very good value card. But any other type of Haven deck that might run Unica could get more value out of this. And he also has some utility in shutting down combo finishers if you anticipate one the next turn. So overall +1. Next, Monk of Purification, 6 mana 4/6, Fanfare, put 2 Monastic Holy Waters into your hand. Most Haven decks aren't going to have the room for this guy, but he's not a bad card for Alana Haven. Alana Haven prefers to combo multiple small cards in the mid-game to put more health on the board than the opponent can deal with. But if the opponent can deal with your first wave of followers, you start running out of fuel very easily, which is why most Alana Haven decks run a secondary win condition like Seraph or Aegis to fall back on. This card gives you more fuel for both proccing Alana's Prayer and for drawing cards, which is pretty useful. Also, if you have to play him in the late game, you can combo him immediately if you need to cycle badly and possibly draw into that secondary win condition. The overall score for most Alana decks would be about a -1, but for Alana Haven specifically, we'll give it a +1. Next, Temple of the Inquisition.
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition!
2 mana Amulet, countdown 5. Whenever an enemy follower is destroyed, subtract 1 from this amulet's countdown. Last words, draw 3 cards. You probably don't want to play this card and Sacred Plea in the same deck, and Sacred Plea is a must include, so the question is, which is better? This does draw 1 extra card, but I still feel like Plea is a better option for a number of reasons. 1, for almost all Haven decks, Plea is the only 1-drop. 2, Haven often plays very much on curve in the mid game because they're catching up. They have to play their Priest on 4, their Lion on 5, their Themesis on 6, and it's very difficult to squeeze in a Plea, so Inquisition would be even harder to squeeze in. And this is a very important factor for countdown amulets since you already have to wait a few turns for them to pop, so you need to play them as soon as possible. 3, Banish is a Haven staple, yet it doesn't synergize with this card since the enemy followers have to be destroyed. 4, Sacred Plea combos very readily with Hollow Dogma in a pinch, so you can quickly draw cards if you need them. If you play Plea on 1 and have a really bad hand, you can play Dogma on Plea and draw 3 cards very quickly. Inquisition is a lot more difficult to pop quickly in a pinch, and if you have to use Dogma, then you're also drawing a 4th card, so you might very well fill up your hand and then burn a card. Ultimately, I don't think the extra card is worth the drawbacks in the current Haven decks. The type of deck that would be able to use this would be a Zoo-style deck that plays a lot of followers, does a decent amount of trading, and could use the extra fuel. Alana Haven sort of plays like a zoo deck, but it's more combo focused, so Inquisition might be okay for that deck, but mana usage is very tight when comboing cards, so Plea is probably still better. So for those reasons, I'm going to have to give it an overall -1. Next, Eagleman, 6 mana 4/5. Ward. Whenever an allied neutral follower comes into play, subtract 1 from this card's cost. Stormhaven mains are crying in a corner right now because this Magnificent Bastard's card art would be perfect for that deck, but it's not a Stormhaven card. For Neutralcraft Haven, it's a pretty good tempo card. Even if you top deck it and have to play it as a vanilla ward, it's not the worst. If you can get some reductions on it though, and combo it with some other cards, it can swing the game. You can't underestimate cost reductions, but you also have to factor in that he's a class Neutralcraft card, so he's still anti-synergy a little bit. Overall, 0. Next, March Hare's Tea Time. 5 mana Amulet, countdown 4. Fanfare, summon a Tin Soldier. Last words, summon a Tin Soldier. And a Tin Soldier is a 5 mana 4/5. Evolve, deal 3 damage to an enemy. The March Hare is of course the Mad Hatter's Tea Party companion from Alice in Wonderland. The Tin Soldier appears to be a loose reference to the Tin Woodsman from Wizard of Oz, since he's wearing a heart necklace, sort of like the one the Tin Man receives from the Wizard of Oz, although technically that was more like a pocket watch. But aside from that, Tin Soldier can be taken both literally and figuratively. As an expression, a Tin Soldier is one who enjoys playing at being a soldier, or a fake soldier. The expression refers to literal tin soldiers, which were children's toys and the predecessors of green plastic army men. The expression reminds me of a song I was taught in elementary school and I've remembered my whole life. The song is called One Tin Soldier, and the version I've always known is the 1971 cover by Coven. This guy appears to be a literal tin soldier though, judging by the size of the rats in the fireplace. Anyway, the amulet is pretty decent. You get full value off the fanfare, so the last words are a bonus. This also gives 2 neutral tokens, which could be good for a Neutralcraft deck. In a normal deck, it has trade-offs with Priest of the Cudgel for utility. It's 1 more mana and you can't banish anything, but the effect isn't binary, and you get better stats, and you get a second one for free later on. In a meta with a lot of aggressive banished targets like Prince Shadow, Priest is more important to have. But in a more value-oriented meta, March Hare could be better. So overall 0. Onto Runecraft, Illusionist, 5 mana 4/4. Fanfare, randomly summon one of your highest cost followers that has been destroyed during this match, and give it Rush. Banish it at the start of your next turn. Last expansion I commented that Rune was the Dirty Thief class, since they stole dragons and then zombies from other classes. This time they're stealing Saradwin's little sister. It also seems that Isabelle is getting better at recruiting people that might be able to help her get her boyfriend back. First it was zombies, but now it's a legit copy. Unfortunately, it's only a temporary illusion. As for the card, it's basically a damage dealing fanfare where the damage gets better as the game goes on. Typically you'll be able to get at least 3 damage playing this on curve, so you're going to get fair value most of the time. And better than that if you can summon bigger things with it. It has a control effect, but it's more suited to a mid-range deck because control decks don't always have cards to play every turn. So turn 5 might come around and nothing strong has died to fuel this, whereas mid-range drops things on curve, so you'll typically have a 2, 3, and 4 drop before this. Also keep in mind that Ice Golem is a nice overstated token that could work well with this. The follower doesn't get banished until your next turn, so you get to keep the ward up during the opponent's turn. But the token is priced at 3 mana, the same as the spell, so you need to not play any other 3 or 4 quest followers to guarantee pulling it. Overall, this card's not bad value, but I'm not really sure if there's a rune deck that it fits into. I'll give it a 0 just for general value though. Next, Felice, Leonardi and Mage, 5 mana 3/6. Fanfare, deal X damage to an enemy follower. X equals the number of neutral cards in your hand. Enhance 7, then evolve this follower. When you evolve it, it gains Storm. This is another damage dealing fanfare, this time for Neutralcraft rune. It's better statted than Illusionist, and it has a handy enhance effect and evolve effect. So pretty good card overall for a rune flavored Neutralcraft deck. Overall +1. Next, Golem Assault, 2 mana spell, put a Conjure Guardian into your hand. Enhance 6, put 2 more into your hand. Earthright, subtract 1 from the cost of all Conjure Guardians in your hand. This could be played in a spell boost deck just for spell generation attached to decent board presence and ward. In an Earthright deck, it has trade-offs with Ancient Alchemist. It's more flexible, but you're overpaying for the tokens if you pay the enhanced cost. Even with the cost reduction, you're missing out on the 2/4 Alchemist, so you're really just breaking even. Earthright decks don't really have a strong set of core cards though, so instead of replacing Ancient Alchemist, you could run both and replace a cheaper card to make this your emergency 4-drop instead. This is also a lot of token spells and token followers bundled into one card for anyone thinking about Path to Purgatory decks. Overall, pretty good, but not game-changing. +1. Next, Master Mage Levy. 6 mana 4/4. Fanfare, deal 3 damage to an enemy. Earthright, deal 3 damage to all enemies instead. Cygames be like, everyone loves Levy, let's print another Levy card. With just the Fanfare, it's a Disaster Witch with a free Crimson Sorcery attached. And Disaster Witch did see some minor play in Daria. Though you don't get any spell boost synergy, you do get Earthright synergy. 3 damage for 6 is very playable, especially when it comes with a body attached. Earthright does already have Calamitous Curse, but with Levy you get to take initiative away from your opponent if you don't already have it, and that can be important. So overall, +1. On to Shadowcraft, Mad Hatter. 7 mana 4/5. Fanfare, destroy an allied follower and summon a Tin Soldier. Doesn't activate if no other allied followers are in play. We've already seen the March Hare, and here is her tea-loving companion. He doesn't look very mad though. Like his companion, he also summons Tin Soldiers. However, he's a 7 mana 4/5 that requires something on the board to activate. And I mean seriously, compared to the other 7-drops Shadow has right now, a card would have to be insanely broken to see play. This guy has no chance at all. Overall, -2. Next, Skeleton Ogre, 2 mana 1/4. Whenever this follower attacks, use Necromancy 4, gain +2/+0. If the effect procs once, this guy is pretty good value and has good stat distribution. If evolved, he can swing as a 5/6 for 2 mana if you have 4 shadows. The Necromancy effect is also flexible. If you don't want to spend the shadows, you can just not attack, and it will only cost you 1 damage ultimately. A 1/4 for 2 isn't even that bad, but Shadow does have a lot of decent early game cards to choose from, so it's kinda hard to justify this one in the deck. Overall, -1. Next, Poisoned Apple of Rebirth. 2 mana spell, change a neutral follower into a Shadowcraft follower, give that follower last words, summon another follower of the same name. The Poisoned Apple trope comes straight from Snow White, who was put to sleep by such an apple. So evidently poison is greater than curses. In a neutralcraft deck, this is potentially better than Curse of Rebirth. The buff can matter with Curse, since you can trade up easily, but the cost can matter with Poison because 4 mana buffs are pretty hard to play, hence Curse not actually seeing any play. I'm not entirely sure what the point of making the follower into a Shadowcraft follower is though. It can't gain neutralcraft buffs, and it's susceptible to Dark Alice banishment, but aside from that, it doesn't really seem to matter. Comparing it to a card that sees no play is somewhat fruitless though. The question is this card playable? It seems pretty decent. It makes a sticky follower for cheap. You always get your mana's worth as long as you don't play it onto a 1-drop. And it also has some combo potential if you put it onto something with last words like Ultimate Carrot, Bellringer Angel, or Goblin Princess. Overall, it's a buff that doesn't immediately do anything, but you're still very likely to get value out of it, so +1. On to Swordcraft, Axe Destroyer, 6 mana 6/5, evolve, destroy an enemy follower or amulet. So in most cases this is going to be a worse Tsubaki. It can target anything, but at the cost of an evolve point and not having ambush. In a budget deck it's an okay substitute, but overall -1. Next, Shield of Flame, 2 mana spell, deal 3 damage to an enemy follower. Deal 6 damage instead if an allied follower with ambush is in play. Is that some Koton no Jutsu? For the record, no, I have never watched Naruto aside from an episode or two. But fire technique, or just adding technique to the end of a martial arts attack, is a pretty standard anime trope. This card is pretty serious removal in a frog deck. Frog decks do have somewhat guaranteed damage with Cyclone Blade. This is cheaper and single target though, so it would most likely replace Whole Souled Swing. In a different deck, it entirely depends on how many ambush followers you're running. Most sword decks don't run any aside from Tsubaki. So overall +1 for Frog Sword specifically. Next, White Ridge Swordsman, 5 mana 3/4, Bane, Ward. When evolved, it gains the text, whenever this follower attacks an enemy follower, destroy the enemy follower before it can deal any damage in return. The evolved text is nice when comboed with Bane, but aside from that, this is a much worse Aurelia. The stats take a huge hit, both the base stats and the evolved stats. And as I've said before, the 5-cost slot for sword is very competitive, so you can't make the cut if you're worse than existing cards and basically have the same utility. Overall, -1. On to the neutrals. First up, Goblin Leader, 3 mana 1/2, summon a goblin at the end of your turn. So it's basically a neutral ascetic knight. It does have the potential to summon more than one goblin, but it's not likely to happen. For the most part, ascetic knight was never great though. It's too easy for your opponent to cleanly remove it without losing anything. In a neutralcraft deck, if you have a Valkyrie Spear already on the board, it's acceptable. At that point you get 2 2/2s for 3, which is basically 4 mana's worth of followers. But under any other conditions, it's not really worth it. Overall, -1. Next, Hector, 5 mana 4/4, Ward. Fanfare, deal 3 damage to an enemy if you have at least 3 neutral cards in your hand. So for a neutralcraft deck, it's a pretty typical damage dealing fanfare. Some classes have access to better cards, but this fleshes out neutralcraft decks a little bit for the classes that don't. Not bad value. Overall 0. Next, Actress Faria, 2 mana 2/2, evolve, give +1/+1 to all other allied neutral followers. Another +1/+1 neutralcraft buff card. On the minus side, this one does come at the cost of an evolve point, but on the plus side, it's a little easier to fit into a deck than the other 4-drop ones we've looked at so far, aside from Alice, and you aren't paying up front for the win more effect, so overall 0. Next, Gruff Mountaineer Captain, 5 mana 3/5, Rush. Whenever this follower attacks an enemy follower with at least 5 attack, this follower can't be damaged until the end of the turn. It's not a bad card for cleaning up weakened evolve followers without using an evolve point of your own. This isn't a neutralcraft card though, so I can't score it only on its merits in a neutralcraft deck. I think basically every deck has better cards to run on 5 mana, and can't think of anything specific that might benefit from running this card. Overall -1. And finally, we're ending on a very adorable card. Snow White Cat Sage, 5 mana 3/4, Fanfare, draw a card, give +1/+1 to another allied follower. Speaking of 5-cost neutral cards, this one's pretty good. 5 mana, draw a card, and a bonus effect is pretty similar to Radiance Angel. It's an okay card when you need to respond to something. It's an okay card to just plop down on an empty board when you have no better plays. It cycles, it buffs something for better trading value. It's just a great all-around card that you can fit into a lot of decks if you want to. Needless to say, it's also a great card for neutralcraft. Overall +1. This is very close to a +2, but it does still have a lot of competition in non-neutralcraft decks, and the buff is useless if you have nothing on the board. Pretty good card though. And that's all we have for today. The next video will be the final one. There are only a few cards left to cover. As soon as I'm done editing this one, I'm going straight into the next one to make sure it's out on time. I would have covered all of those cards in this video, except I wanted to do a little bonus at the end of that video, and it's going to take a little bit of time, but I should have that video out not long after this one. Hope you all enjoyed the review. Please share your opinions in the comments below, and tune in again next time.